Good morning and welcome to our monthly Dean's Book Review, and a big happy Halloween for all who celebrate. We're really excited to have you join us. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. My pronouns are she and hers, and I have the privilege of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And it's also my privilege to welcome you here today to this really important and exciting conversation, which is in recognition of October, which celebrates Mental Health Awareness Month and National Disabilities Awareness Month. So it was really appropriate that today we look and we read and we review this powerful book, Three Generations, No Imbeciles, Eugenics, the Supreme Court, and Buck versus Bell. But before we jump into the book, I do want to take a moment, as I always do, to acknowledge that the land that we're on here today, at least I'm coming to you from the Salt Lake Valley, is land which is named for the Ute tribe. It is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. And even though today's outreach activity does not involve tribes or discussion of tribes, that will be next month's Dean's Book Review, I am really excited to have an opportunity to talk about this book, which hits close to home to me. So my youngest aunt, my grandparents had 9 or 10 daughters, depending on who you talk to, a little bit of family drama. But my youngest aunt had severe mental and physical disabilities. She couldn't speak. She had to wear a diaper until her death and could not take care of herself. And so my grandparents made the choice to have her sterilized through a hysterectomy. They were very fearful that she would be raped and become pregnant, which is very much at the heart of today's book. Again, the book is Three Generations, No Imbeciles, Eugenics, the Supreme Court, and Buck versus Bell by Paul A. Lombardo. So I'm very interested. This book struck close to home. We had a chance to chat a little bit with the panelists yesterday, and I'm really excited to hear their thoughts on the book. The book refers to a famous, or rather infamous, quote that says, quote, "Three generations of imbeciles are enough," end quote, which were from the Supreme Court opinions from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. in the 1927 case of Buck versus Bell. The ruling allowed states to forcibly sterilize residents in order to prevent feeble-minded and socially inadequate people from having children. It is the only time the Supreme Court endorsed surgery as a tool for government policy. It's really a startling narrative that exposes the case and the fraudulent roots of the case. So again, I very much am excited to hear from our panelists and to hear their thoughts on this topic that not only is historical, but really has ramifications and reverberations through society today. So each of our panelists is going to speak for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then they're going to have about 10 minutes of open dialogue between themselves. Again, I had a chance to listen to them a little bit yesterday, and it was wonderful to hear just their open dialogue. And then we're going to open it up to you for questions. So if you look at the bottom of the page, you'll see that there's a button, a Q&A button. So if you want to go ahead and type in a question to our panelists, and you don't have to wait until the end to type in your question, I'll go ahead and ask those questions of our panelists when we get to the Q&A a little bit later. But first, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. Our first speaker has been an amazing addition, one of our more recent additions to the College of Law, Natasha Carlson. She is our Associate Director of Student Affairs, working very closely with our students. And so she's going to start us off with a very personalized look at the book. Then we're going to move to Diana Canyon, who I'm very proud is one of our esteemed alumna and adjunct at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. She's also a partner at the Canon Disability Law PC. So we will hear from her second. And then last, but certainly not least, is another relatively new, although it's been a little bit of time now, I think it's been maybe 2 years, is Professor Beth Jennings, who is a member of our faculty at S.J. Quinney College of Law. And so she will end with her closing thoughts. And then again, we'll have about 10 minutes of discussion, open discussion between the panelists, and then we're open up for your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Carlson. Director Carlson?
Hi, morning. So before I even started this book, I had never heard the word eugenics. I wasn't even sure what that even meant. So I thought I'd kind of start off with that, since there may still be many of us who don't even know what that is. So it's the practice of advocacy of controlled selective breeding of human populations as by sterilization to improve the population's genetic composition. And so many leaders, many leading figures in the US in the late 19th century and early 20th century were strong advocates of the idea that criminal, sexual, promiscuous, and mental health problems were inherited traits. And so that's just kind of where all of this is coming from, is you have people who are advocates towards controlling the population and what that looked like. And to kind of give a back history of some of the things from the book, in 1917, Dr. Albert Priddy, who was a superintendent of Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded, was sued for sterilizing Willie Mallory on the grounds that Mallory was held and operated against her will. And so her husband, George Mallory, came home to find his wife and his daughters were taken to the Virginia State Colony, and social workers and police accused George Mallory's house of being a brothel. And that's why they broke up the family while he was away. And so though Dr. Priddy won the case, the judge told him to stop what he was doing because the law wasn't in his favor. And this was led to the Buck versus Bell, because he campaigned and chose Carrie Buck as the test case. So as I was reading this book, it kind of struck a chord with me, because I'm a person who has learning disabilities. But what does that mean? You have a huge spectrum of people who have all sorts of disabilities, but are very capable of making choices. In Carrie's case, the only thing that I think in this, the reason that they basically committed her to the colony is because she had a child out of wedlock. Basically, she was actually raped by a foster family. Her mother was already there, but the people who examined her said that she was feeble-minded, even though she was capable of making her own choices and taking care of herself. So this just kind of struck a chord, because it's, again, as someone with actual learning disabilities, I wonder myself, if I had been raised at this time, if I would have been also sterilized. I luckily was not born during that time. I also have parents who care for my well-being and helped me get resources so I could be the successful person I am today. But again, it's just unfortunate that we have people who we trust in the sciences, and those who help make laws, deciding what goes and what doesn't, but not having people's rights. I guess not caring enough about people and for their well-being. It's just unfortunate because these were tools that were created to help us as a humanity, to further ourselves, and that's not the case in this. So that's where I'm kind of taking this from. I also have a cousin who is on the autistic spectrum, but is incapable of taking care of himself. And this was also a conversation brought up by my aunt, who I guess, basically, she said, do we need to sterilize him so that he is not a harm to society? He is very aggressive now that he's older. And so I guess there's this, well, what's right and what's wrong? Should we be making decisions for people in these situations? But again, you have people who are very capable of taking care of themselves and making decisions, but might not be on the intellectual level of people who are making laws and are in these sciences. So yeah, that's where I kind of took it with this book. So.
Our next speaker is Diana Cannon.
Okay, let's see, make sure I'm on unmute here. Thank you for that, Natasha. That was very nice. For me, I think this book, I like to see this case, the Buck v. Bell case, in kind of a historical context. And by that, I mean that what happened after the case, not just individually to the people who were involved, but basically what that case spawned, which I think is one of the more interesting aspects of the case. It's been used not only here in America by various institutions and people to, I think, hurt other people, but also used by other countries. And so the first thing that struck me was how the Buck v. Bell case and if you haven't read the case, the famous line is 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so that was the impetus behind eliminating people from our society who may be different. Now, the tragedy, I think, in the Buck v. Bell case is that Carrie Buck was what we would consider, quote unquote, a normal individual, as was her mother, as was her daughter, who was raised by essentially the foster family where the father had raped her until she passed away. And there was no reason for her to be sterilized, and as there is in all of the examples I'm about to give. But I think the thing that struck me was the Nazis were using this in Germany, using this case to say that their sterilization of groups of people that they didn't like could be sterilized or killed. Additionally, I think that one of the things that really strikes me, and people think, you might think, well, this was a long time ago. But the Buck v. Bell case just really was never overturned and was used for years and years throughout time to, again, propagate all kinds of problems. For example, and I think this is another thing that really is also very tragic, against prisoners. So in our own court system, having people forcibly sterilized in our court system. So for example, there was recent investigative reporting that the California penal system was sterilizing female inmates. And this was done between 2003 and 2014. So this is not a long time ago. And they were going in to, they forcibly sterilized about 1,400 female inmates. And it's not clear how many were sterilized between 2003 and 2014, but 97 to 2003. They've put together the entire list, and they found that about 1,400 women were sterilized. And that what would happen is very similar to what was going on with the Virginia Center, in that they would sterilize people and they would often not tell them what was happening to them. So they would, for example, bring someone like Carrie in and say, well, you are ill, you need this procedure. Or they might say, for example, you're having an appendectomy, or you're having some other kind of procedure. But the reality is they were being sterilized. And that's exactly what was happening in the California penal system. And they were relying on this precedent that was set by this case. And I think the other thing to note is that, just like with the Nazis, where they were taking their racism and using this case to support what they were doing, the same thing with the prison system is that in California, and you know what, there's another discussion about the racism in the prison system and the racism in the American justice system, but that, of course, about 14 out of those 1,400 women, I believe about 80% of them were African American. And so obviously many of these repercussions of this case have not only hurt people who, well, they've basically fallen, I think, on people who may not be white citizens. Instead, they're people of color, and they're the ones who are bearing the burden, as well as women. However, I think one thing that was interesting when I read the book was that I'm just going to say, this awful man, Dr. Purdy, I really don't think he was a good person, was also doing it to men. You know, he was also sterilizing men. And one of the things that he thought was that criminality could be passed down from generation to generation. So if somebody had criminal propensities or committed a crime, he was going to sterilize them in the hopes that they could be gotten rid of, or that trait could be gotten rid of in society. The next thing that kind of stood out to me was how also over time that the threat of sterilization or sterilization in our system, in our prison system, has been used to, for example, get people out early. So there's been judges who have actually said, well, if you'll accept sterilization, we'll shorten your sentence. And so this has also impacted people who've been in our criminal system. And it's, I think, also appalling. Then the other thing that I thought of is how these policies have been used against people who are immigrants, essentially. And so, of course, what stood out to me was the more recent complaints about the women at the border who claimed that ICE has sterilized them. A similar doctor, when you look into the reports, was telling women that they needed a hysterectomy, or if they were having, not telling them they needed a hysterectomy, but telling them they needed some sort of medical treatment because they were ill. And come to find out that they were sterilized. And so this is just obviously very recent. And so people throughout throughout time have been relying on this case as something that allows them to choose, whether it be they don't have my same morality. So for example, maybe they've decided that the people aren't getting married and they're not keeping their sexuality in the bounds of marriage. So therefore, they need to be sterilized because they don't have my same moral values. People who are homosexuals, we're going to make sure that they're sterilized so that they can't pass this down to anybody else. People who are criminals, these are things that you can pass down to your children. Or even we want to get rid of various races in our society. And indeed, these kinds of sterilization procedures have fallen on people who don't have the means to protect themselves. And I think the other thing that really struck me was the letter, for example, and I think it was from Mr. Mallory. Did I get the name right on that? Where he wrote to him and said, "Release my wife." And it wasn't the most perfect English that the letter was written in, but it was the most, I felt, beautiful plea that was based on love and reason. And I think that he really did love his wife and he wanted his wife back. And the fact that somebody could use the power that they have and the power of the courts in this unethical manner to treat a family like this person did, but then that this cruelty could propagate throughout history to be used in other countries as well as our own penal system is terrifying. And I think that's the last thing I would say, which would be that when you have people who need protection, like Natasha mentioned, or where you have people who may not have the means to protect themselves, whether they be quote unquote normal or not, you need actors in the legal system who have the ethical, who have ethics, who are actually going to, for example, stand up for someone like Carrie Bell. Now, if you've read anything else about the case, you realize that, and this is taken up in other books, but that the attorney that was appointed for her knew the judge, knew Dr. Purdy, and really was on their side and really did nothing to protect her. And so when you have people who are using the power of the law and they don't really care about other people. They just want the world to be reflected, their world to reflect what they want. What you really need is somebody who understands that diversity is important. They understand that you can't be taking people's rights away. And, that the decisions need to be made. And of course, he thought he was making decisions on behalf of people. I'm sure he felt very comfortable telling other people that they needed to be sterilized so that their traits couldn't be passed on. But I think that's a very, it's a very damning demonstration of what can happen when someone's power runs amok. And so hopefully what we have in our system is people who will be more ethical when they're lawyers or judges and treat people, all people, no matter what their differences may be, with respect. So that's all I have to say today.
Here to respect. So next we have Professor Beth Jennings.
All right. So first off, I just wanted to address Derek's question in the Q&A. What's the status of the sterilization laws in Utah? So the sterilization laws in Utah are, I would say, pretty middle of the road compared to other states. They're definitely not broad. But so if there is a person, a protected person who's over the age of 18, and either the person themselves or their guardian would like to have sterilization performed, they have to petition the court. And so they would need to petition the court, and the protected person can also present, if they are arguing against being sterilized, they can, hear arguments, the court can hear arguments on both sides about the issue. And so the judge is going to look at things like the degree of the impairment and whether or not it's permanent, how clearly the person understands reproduction generally and contraception, and then, their capacity to be able to parent, a bunch of different factors. But it is a little bit more protective than just saying a guardian could bring somebody in for a sterilization procedure without the person knowing. They would have to appear in front of a judge to get that approved. Throughout time, though, another way that the law has supported eugenics movements is laws about who can marry each other. And so a lot of people are familiar with, interracial marriages and the loves and, the ability for people who are not of the same racial category as determined by the government for them to marry. And Utah has a pretty long history of trying to control what types of marriages Utah will say are valid and which ones are void. So starting in 1898, the legislature added a category of just a general void marriages that includes, and this is language I'm quoting from the statute, an idiot or a lunatic. So that was one category that was void. And then, kind of more typical ones that you're used to seeing about age or whether it was solemnized by somebody who was not able to do that. And then there are some miscegnation laws tucked in there as well. But as time goes by, you can really see that the way that marriage laws shift and change are really related to these moral panics that were happening at the time. So in 1907, a void marriage, they added someone who has syphilis or gonorrhea, or somebody with chronic epileptic fits. Again, that's the language in the statute. Except for they did not give a nice carve out that if you're a woman over 45, it's fine if you have epilepsy. You can go ahead and get married still. And so that kind of stays in the statute for a number of years. And then, along with those same typical ones about age and the miscegnation laws. But as time goes on, you can see that there's one, it adds here in Utah about somebody who is already married to somebody else. So that kind of addressing the history of Utah's history with polygamy. And then, as we approach 1979, they added between persons of the same sex. So as the LGBT movement started, this is, of course, about 10 years after Stonewall, but you can see that now we're seeing that moral panic is rising to the top. So then we better add that into our statute about void marriages. And then in 1989, on the list of diseases that would make your marriage void, they added acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS. So definitely that's right in line with the moral panic around AIDS that's happening at that time. In 1999, and, in the interim, we start seeing some of these things falling off. So, the miscegnation laws are going away. The laws about, STIs and STDs and epilepsy are falling off the void marriages as those moral panics kind of start to resolve themselves in society. And today, we don't see any of those really troubling limitations on marriage that came along with the eugenics movement. But I think it's easy to see that as different moral panics rise up in our society, the legislature responds to them by creating laws that in retrospect, sitting from 2021, we can see that they're troubling. But, back then that was a way that they were hoping to, I guess, address the issues that were happening during that time. And so, and when we're thinking about Buck v. Bell, it really, the part of the law that we're talking about with Carrie Buck has never been overruled by the Supreme Court. So there was a subsequent case that was Skinner v. Oklahoma, where the Supreme Court said that, well, you can't sterilize somebody as a punishment for a crime. But the part about sterilizing people with mental disabilities or developmental disabilities, that's still a standing case from the Supreme Court. And so, thinking about that, as we're looking at all this, is that just that these laws are still good in some places, and a lot of people are still subject to these types of laws. That it's pretty troubling. One really big case that made national headlines is Britney Spears, who is under a conservatorship in California. And here in Utah, there's a difference between a conservatorship and a guardianship. So guardianship is about the person and medical decisions and where they live and those kind of legal issues. And then a conservatorship covers just the money aspects of their life. But in California, it looks like the conservatorship covers both of those things. And in June, this past June, Britney Spears testified in court that her conservator, who was at that time, I believe her father, had required her to get an IUD to prevent her from having any children. And then one of the factors, I don't know if it's a factor in California, but one of the factors here in Utah is whether or not a person would be able to care for a child. And as we all know, Britney Spears clearly has the means to make millions and millions of dollars per year. And so I think that case in particular is really interesting and actually really troubling as well. Just knowing that as a person in your life, if you are struggling with mental health or possibly, what your struggles are become more public, it seems as if many courts are pretty willing to put you under the care of another person, whether or not your whatever's troubling you is a long-term issue, it's going to be chronic, or whether or not treatment might be able to resolve that and you'd be able to care for yourself again. I do think it's also interesting that we see these higher profile conservatorship cases with celebrities. Another one I can think of is Amanda Bynes, also is under a conservatorship. We don't see that with male celebrities. And I think we can all think of some pretty high profile male celebrities who have demonstrated some really troubling and dangerous to themselves and others behavior. And we're not seeing a lot of male celebrities being subject to conservatorships. So I think that's also the gender aspect of these type of actions is really interesting to me. And I do think it's of note that the history of eugenics in the United States was a really popular across all political spectrums. I mean, this was not just one party or another party. We had some very high profile philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, the Rockefellers, Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood. Part of her push for birth control was because these unwanted babies and just coming at birth control from a eugenic standpoint, that was one of her goals in establishing widespread access to birth control. And I think that it's important to note that here in the United States, for reasons I'm sure many people who are smarter than me have written about, we really do have a long and storied history with eugenics, and it seems like when things get hard, or we have whatever the next moral panic is that's floating to the surface in our society, that is a crutch that we lean on. And it's troubling to me because there's a lot of aspects of all of our lives, especially if you look at how broad some of the void marriage laws were throughout time in Utah, that could put us on the chopping block and make us be subject to sterilization and other types of laws that could really limit how we live our lives. So I think that was all that I wanted to say. But yeah, I think just keeping an eye on eugenics generally, it does bubble to the surface. I mean, most recently, I've heard a lot of conversations about vaccines where people are saying, oh, if somebody doesn't get vaccinated, then I guess they deserve to die. I mean, I have heard it said much nicer than that, but I've also heard it say that that plainly. And that really smacks of kind of these same eugenics beliefs that I think that we've seen throughout history.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right. So now we have about 10 minutes for our panelists to maybe chat amongst themselves a little bit, things that struck them with each other's comments.
I'd like to talk about Britney Spears. I think there were 2 documentaries that came out during that time. And I think this last one, or maybe it was an article that I read, that she, when she was talking to the judge, she said that she didn't know that she could petition what was happening to her. And I think that going back to having people who represent you and have your best interests, and are ethically good, I think good people, when representing their clients, is like you explain to them what their rights are, what you can do. And in this case of Carrie Buck, like she didn't have that at all. Like Diana said, that this lawyer actually was on the board of the Virginia colony and was pushing their own agenda and not helping Carrie. And so there was no due process. And I think that's in the same case for Britney Spears, is that you have someone who's coming in and accusing you of not being in the right mindset and that you're incapable of making your own choices. But hey, you can go out and work and make millions, but you just can't have children. So it's just, this didn't stop in the 20s. This is continuing to affect people's lives, like in this case, Britney Spears. So.
Yeah, I think that is interesting. That I think also in the Britney Spears case, I think it's just interesting to note that Britney Spears herself was paying, I believe it was around $500,000 a year for the representation of her conservator, and I would imagine that if a conservatorship ended, that person would no longer be making $500,000 a year. And again, I think it's just back to this, what Diana said about making sure that people involved are behaving in their most ethical manner to make sure that protected people are being protected to the extent that's necessary. And also, that whatever choices are being made for them are the right decision.
One of the other things that to me was very interesting, as I tried to just kind of read through the list of things that they were sterilizing people for. So it wasn't just intellectual disabilities, and as I stated earlier, or moral turpitude, I guess you would say, but things like being blind or being deaf. And I don't think that there are many people who would think we should sterilize somebody because they're blind, or think that we should sterilize someone because they're deaf. But at that, and I guess it's tempting to take a look and say to yourself, oh, well, that was then. We would never do that now. And I think that's kind of why I thought the historical perspective of it was so interesting, because it continues to go on. And I don't know of any particular cases. I'm not, trying to say that I know of particular cases right now where people are being sterilized because they're deaf or blind. But I think it brings you to the next question. And so forgive me if I'm not trying to get us off track, but, if you have someone who has a disability, are they not worthy of living a good life? And what is a good life? And what are the rights that might entail? And so then the next question that comes to me, and I hope this isn't too controversial, but so say your parents, and let's just put this in the context of a nice moral marriage, okay? And the nice heterosexual couple are married, and then they become pregnant, and perhaps that they have a child with Down syndrome. So you look at, and I'm going to use another country, not our country, but there's been some recent articles on people who abort children with Down syndrome. And I'm not saying I'm in a position to judge that, but for example, in Denmark, which, I don't know if anybody read that article. It was in the Atlantic not that long ago. And it was talking about how almost everybody in Denmark, that couples or anyone who's pregnant can get a test to determine whether their child has Down syndrome, and then they can abort the child if they wish. And that last year there were something like, 18 people born with Down syndrome in the entire country. And so essentially people are eradicating that disability. And then there were a few people who were interviewed for the article talking about how they chose not to be tested and to get what they get and not throw a fit. And they ended up with, a Down syndrome child, and they wouldn't have had it any other way. But the majority of people, at least in this particular case, are choosing to eliminate that disability. And I know that that's a little far outside of what we're talking about, but it makes me wonder, if people are willing to sterilize you for deafness or blindness or in an intellectual disability, and then the next choice is we get to make the decision who lives or dies based upon the disability. I don't think that's a far step to take, and it's frightening, I think. Not only sterilizing adults against their will or sterilizing people with a disability, but then to make the choice that people who have a disability don't deserve to be alive. Now, I'm not, people get to make their own choices. But I think that that's just another step in that direction. That's a little bit frightening. I don't know if anybody has anything to say about that, but that's kind of where this took me. And I also think your ideas about vaccination, about people being vaccinated against, can the government have the power to vaccinate people against their will, is also very interesting. If we know for the good of all, which is why they were doing this in the first place, for the good of society. So those are my comments. I don't know if it's hard to make comments when people are on mute. Unmute yourself, Natasha. Let's have a chat.
It is hard. It's hard too because I feel like it's a conversation also, but since it's a webinar, we can't really converse with the people who are watching, which would also be really nice. But I do think it's of note that these sterilization procedures were done in a lot of institutional settings that weren't about disability. I mean, residential schools for Indigenous people, residential schools for deaf and blind people. So, you hate to say that it was something that happened very commonly, but it did. And I will say, too, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you said that people aren't necessarily being sterilized these days for those types of things. I'm not sure that we would know because when you have a child with a disability, once they get close to the age of 18, the parents can petition the court before they turn 18 to just set up a guardianship, and it's pretty smooth sailing. I mean, I feel like I've been in the probate court when they've had this on the calendar, and there might be 10, 12 families there trying to get guardianship of their child with a disability. And in many ways, it's great because, many of those children, they would need protection and they need support and they need to be able to access medical care. But once I was at the probate calendar and observed a child who was deaf, and the mom had to ask the court for an ASL interpreter so that the child could understand what was happening. But that's only because the mom asked. I'm not sure that they would have even identified that as a need for the child to even understand what was going on. And that felt concerning to me personally, just because even if you agree perhaps that your parents should be your guardians, not even having access to understand if you're 17 years old, and it seemed like, and if your mom is identifying that you can understand the proceedings, then you'd think the court would want to investigate that a little bit more with the people, but I don't know.
Well, I would like to just break in. This has been a great discussion to answer or to ask the couple of questions that we have. So the first question says, history tells us that the court is not perfect. Example of Dred Scott and Buck. What does the Buck decision tell us about erring on the side of protecting individual rights to medical decisions in the present time? I'm thinking specifically of those who pose vaccine mandates in the COVID era.
I mean, I think that's a good question. The court is not always right. I mean, and I will say about vaccine mandates, I mean, there is another Supreme Court case, it's like Jacobson versus Massachusetts, where the court said that compulsory vaccination's fine. States are allowed to require, like, not just require vaccination, but like actually like go in and physically vaccinate people. And that has also not been overturned. So, I think it's interesting when thinking about like how the court's opinions have changed over the years too, because clearly historically the court didn't have a lot of trouble, it seems like, saying that the state had really broad sweeping powers. So yeah, I mean, I think that there is some open questions about individual rights, and not even just medical decisions, just individual rights generally. I haven't seen, though, and maybe I've missed something in the news, I haven't seen states mandating vaccines in that same way, though, like actually like they did with polio, like just going into schools and handing all the kids a bunch of sugar cubes. I haven't seen that happening anywhere, but I mean, maybe it is. So, I mean, maybe Matt, you could give us a little more context about what the question is, but I do think that, yeah, we should definitely not just say, oh, the Supreme Court said it, that must be the right thing. I think we're always open to these conversations where we're identifying mistakes that the law has made in the past, and I'm certain we are presently making mistakes in the law, and looking forward to the time when our children and grandchildren can look back and say, wow, they really messed that one up, because I'm certain that it's still happening today in ways we may not even be able to identify at this point.
Wonderful. We have another question. I'm in Louisiana and used to work with Disability Rights Louisiana. People have actually recently tried to sterilize their interdicts. The most recent was in 2018 that I know of. Louisiana has very broad sterilization law that technically allows even children without disabilities to be sterilized. That's why I asked my earlier question. It's shocking, to say the least.
That is really surprising. And I think, too, that kind of harkens back to a really strong sense that parents have that they, the decisions that parents can make about their children. Sometimes it's astounding to me sometimes that, I just always think a lot about the Maya Angelou saying that, the job of a parent is to get their kid to adulthood with, as whole as possible. And so I think that it's pretty shocking that somebody would be able and allowed to sterilize a child, especially a child who, maybe they just feel like it. I mean, that's pretty staggering.
You would hope that the court system would be set up so that there is somebody who can really protect the rights of the child and really have that, in mind. I think sometimes children do need to be protected from their parents.
I was gonna say the same thing, because you have cases where usually the mother has kept their child sick in order to control. And I think that, okay, we're focusing so much when it comes to the child not being capable. What about the parent not being in the right mind and having their child cared for? And so it's just, I was just thinking about that. Like, I know I've read a few things about mothers who have intentionally kept their children sick in order to control or benefit from it. So
I did also want to address what Susan Dyer said earlier about an article in the New Yorker. I haven't read that article yet, but I did post a link to a podcast about a woman who was sterilized without her knowledge, in a similar way that Diana described earlier. And it was ostensibly because her mother said she was unfit. She went into the hospital for an appendix removal and then came out with many organs having been removed. And she argued to the doctors that she was unfit. The doctors performed the surgery. And then it turned out that the real reason why the mother had wanted to get her sterilized is that she didn't want to share an inheritance with any future offspring that this woman might have. And so, that I think too is of note, that, I think we're talking a lot about people doing these sterilizations for, maybe it's appropriate or not appropriate, but I mean, I think there really are some very serious consequences to just guardianship and conservatorship generally that people could use for nefarious purposes if, there aren't protections in place, like Natasha, you were saying.
And Beth, it did sound like you were saying that here in Utah, there's some level of protection because there's an opportunity for the individual who it's being argued should be sterilized to argue against that. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the court also, the court can appoint a guardian ad litem. So I feel like there is an opportunity for them to also be represented by an attorney. And typically that the guardian ad litem's fee is paid for by whoever the petitioner is. So if like the parents are petitioning for sterilization, they would be paying their own lawyer and they would be paying for the guardian ad litem as well.
Well, we have probably time for one more question, and I see that Eva just supplied it to us. And also Matthew supplied some clarification. So maybe I'll do his clarification first, and then I'll go to her question. So he says, no need to clarify. I was thinking specifically of the reliance on the Jacobson precedent that was mentioned. I agree the mandates are less onerous and give folks outs, but I can see a Fifth Amendment argument being made by federal employees who lose their job if they refuse to get vaxxed. Thanks for the webinar. All right, so Eva's question is, states have an interest in minimizing the number of children who must be placed in foster care, supported financially, and then provided adult social services for life in case of a parent medically determined to be intellectually incapable of parenting. How much weight is the interest given in the court cases you've observed? In the cases you mentioned, are the parents trying to sterilize their children for the same reasons? That is, so that the parents don't end up having to raise all the children that their disabled daughters might have because they do not understand sexual reproduction, much less consent. Also, I see a difference between vaccines, where the individual's health can affect others by inadvertently infecting them, even asymptomatically, and sterilization, where there's no effect on others unless the individual becomes pregnant or impregnates a woman. I'll just start us off off here on that first point from Eva. So I had a chance to work in South Africa at an earlier point in my career. And the case that I worked on was the treatment action campaign case. And the lawyers in that case and the advocates in that case were actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And what was happening in that case, going to the state interest, KwaZulu-Natal, which is a province within South Africa, was specifically denying retroviral drugs to women with AIDS who were pregnant. The drugs had huge success in ensuring that the babies were not infected with AIDS, but the province didn't want that, because then there would be lots of orphaned children that the state would have to take care of. And so the state was deliberately denying those drugs to pregnant women with AIDS so that their children would be born with AIDS. Horrific case. And ultimately, the South Africa Supreme Court held that that was illegal under both domestic and international law. So kind of an example, a little bit of a flip on what we've been talking about with impacting the children. But you are absolutely right that states have done and provinces have done some horrific things in the past because of that interest in not having to support wards of the state. But I'll open it up to our panelists to make other points.
That is a horrific story. I hadn't heard that before. That's really upsetting. I mean, I think that a lot of arguments are made, public policy, the argument, trying to avoid state support of children. And it's interesting because I don't often hear it argued that, we're going to have to find foster care for all of these children, which is a huge pressing need in the United States, is like a lack of foster homes. It really is always like, we don't want to pay for healthcare and food and necessities. And so it does get, it gets upsetting to me personally, I think, when we're talking about money and you see the ability of individuals in our society to accumulate so much wealth, and then we're talking about whether or not, a person should have food or a child should go to the doctor, because we don't want to pay for it. And so I think that just kind of is more the U.S. telling on itself a little bit about what we are prioritizing. But I mean, I think that, like I said, I don't know, to address Eva's question about things we have observed. I haven't observed a case where somebody was petitioning to have their child sterilized. But, I think that having at least some protection for the protected person, I think, is really important. I think if they have a capacity, and maybe it's not even just about sterilization, like maybe you are a protected person and you have the ability to make medical decisions for yourself, but because of your disability, you can't make financial decisions for yourself. Well, maybe you are only protected in the ways you need protection. You're not protected in the ways that you have capacity to do for yourself. So making sure that, like the limits and there are limits on the powers that a guardian could have over a person, I think, is important. So assessments and really being able to make sure that people are getting the help they need and not the help that they don't need. I think that is a huge part of it. But I think it's hard because, courts are very busy, and doing assessments like that take time and they take money. And I think that there's kind of an unwillingness to go there all the time, especially if you have letters from doctors and, that like to really deeply explore how much protection an individual needs. But I mean, I'm sure we've all known elders who reach a point in their life where they need some type of protection. Maybe they need a guardianship or a conservatorship of them. And it does seem like when you're talking about elders, there can sometimes be also not a lot of care taken to make sure that they are getting protected in the ways that are most appropriate for them. Because I think we've all kind of heard some sad, bad stories about people getting guardianship over elders and then the elders becoming in a worse position. So I think it just kind of shows our values as a society that were, prioritizing money, I guess, and over, making sure that people are treated with care by our legal system.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our hour. I know for me that went by incredibly quickly, both because I learned a lot and have been educated and a bit horrified by what's been shared today. So this is a very interesting topic. I encourage everybody to think about how they can help in the future. I also want to acknowledge, I see that the author of today's book, Paul Lombardo, appears to be in the list of attendees. So since the author is with us, I just want to, or appears to be with us, I want to say thank you for writing this book and for shining a light on this topic and pointing out that this is not just something that happened in 1927. These are issues, as I think our panelists have done an amazing job of teasing out, that still are with us today. And I encourage us all to think very carefully about these topics moving forward. I also just want to briefly invite you. Next month is Native American Heritage Month, and so we will be reading The Watchmen by Louise Erdrich, which is, she just won the Pulitzer Prize for that, and we'll be talking about that next month. So I invite you to join us next month. In the interim, again, if you celebrate Halloween, enjoy Halloween, and we look forward to seeing you in November. Thanks so much. Bye.